Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Amit Orari, and coming up in today's newscast, the manhunt coming to an end with Israeli security forces eliminating the terrorists killing the Yaniv brothers. Meantime, will it be much easier to get married? The Supreme Court passing new rules for civil marriage. And the world is celebrating International Women's Day, and we're taking a look at Israel with our inspirational panel. An unusual incident at the Gaza border as an explosive device being activated at the southern Gaza Strip border exploded at noon today after an IDF bulldozer ran over it. The IDF responded by firing shells at a Hamas military position. The IDF spokesman stated that there were no casualties among the soldiers, and the Palestinians reported 2 wounded whose condition was described as minor. Following the unusual security incident, farmers in the Gaza Strip were asked to evacuate the fields near the border. The IDF is currently investigating when the bomb was placed at the border and whether it was a terror group that placed it or whether it was planted there in some other way. According to reports from Gaza, eyewitnesses said that it was an explosive device that had apparently been planted in the past and exploded under a bulldozer that passed over it. A combined IDF and border police raid eliminated a terror cell hiding out in Jenin that included the gunmen who killed Hallel and Yagel Yaniv last Sunday in the Palestinian town of Hawara. 6 terrorists were killed in the operation and 2 soldiers were lightly wounded. ILTV Steve Leibovich reports.
After a week-long manhunt, security forces eliminated the terrorist gunman responsible for the murder of the Yaniv brothers last Sunday in the Palestinian town of Hawara. 49-year-old Abdel Karausa was the gunman who shot the brothers at close range. He was killed along with 5 other Palestinians at their hideout in Jenin. The Jenin operation was carried out by a combined army and border police operation, laying siege to the building where Karausa and his terror cell were holed up. Prime Minister Netanyahu praised the operation and said this will be the fate of whoever tries to harm us.
לוחמי צה"ל, השב"כ והימ"מ חיסלו היום את המחבל המתועב שרצח בדם קר את 2 האחים המקסימים, הלל ויגל יניב, זיכרונם לברכה. לוחמינו האמיצים פעלו באופן כירורגי בלב מאורת המרצחים. אני משבח אותם ושולח איחולי החלמה לפצועים מקרב כוחותינו. כפי שאני חוזר ואומר, פעם אחר פעם, מי שיפגע בנו, דמו בראשו.
Troops also raided Nablus where several terrorist suspects were arrested, including 2 of Karausa's sons, without incident. Meanwhile, there were clashes reported in Hawara between local Palestinians and Jewish vigilantes. After the murder of the Yaniv brothers, vigilantes carried out a violent rampage of revenge, burning houses and cars. Since then, tensions have been high in the town, with soldiers struggling to separate Palestinians and the vigilantes. In an attempt to retaliate for the Jenin raid, terrorists from Gaza fired a rocket toward Israel, setting off the red alert in Sderot. The rocket fell harmlessly on the Palestinian side of the border.
And joining us now for the latest security update is former head of the military's prosecution office for Judea and Samaria, Lieutenant Colonel and attorney Maurice Hirsch. Maurice, let's start with yesterday's operation. The gunman responsible for murdering the Yaniv brothers has been neutralized. What more can you tell us about how the security forces identified him and who are the others killed with him?
Well, I think what's important to note from this whole event is really the cooperation between Hamas and Fatah of Abu Mazen. Obviously, we're talking about a terrorist who moved from Hawara, which is south of Shechem, of Nablus, and moved all the way to the north to Jenin. That isn't something which is done easily. It requires quite an extensive logistical operation. And so that was probably what allowed the forces to be able to track his movements. And then to understand that he's working together with all the terrorist groups hand in hand. That's something which is both worrying but also very telling of what's going on at the Palestinian Authority at the moment, where all of the terrorists are working together, whether it be Hamas on the one hand or Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah on the other.
Now, as you mentioned, there were incursions yesterday, both in Jenin and in Nablus. They were successful, but there are apparently many more cells still operating in northern Samaria. Intensive operations have been carried out for many months with hundreds of arrests there. Is any of this actually making a dent in the terrorist threat?
Oh, so it definitely is. That we know that there are terrorist cells that are being really being thwarted every single day because of the activities of the security forces and the IDF. What we're not seeing, obviously, on the other side is the Palestinian security forces operating. There was even the US suggestion that more Palestinian forces be trained, and then the response of Hussein al-Sheikh, the PLO Executive Committee Secretary, saying, we're not interested in that. We will not allow the Palestinian forces to ever work against the Palestinian terrorists. So every day the IDF is really encroaching a little bit more and a little bit more, arresting more and more terrorists. And whilst it seems to be a never-ending flow, obviously that barrel is emptying out slowly but surely. Unfortunately, what we're also seeing, and we also saw yesterday again, was the active participation of the Palestinian forces, not in arresting and apprehending the terrorists, but in fighting together with the terrorists against the Israeli forces.
Interesting. Now, Maurice, we're hearing just right now about an explosive device placed near the Gaza border. Is there any more information we can talk about right now that you know?
Well, so that we know that the Gaza border has been relatively quiet for a while. We understand that there are still activities that are going on. There are constant attempts by Hamas, and we've seen it sporadically mentioned in the news recently with Hamas activists Hamas terrorists from Gaza trying to really operate terrorists coming in from Gaza, many of them. Just last year, there were 424,000 entries from Gaza into Israel. And we know that the terrorists are relatively acting with impunity and freely as part of that new security coordination that Israel seemed to have forged with Hamas under the Bennett-Lapid government, with the approval of Minister Gantz. And now we're seeing some of those really reactions coming up with that free movement, the ability to get right up towards the fence and to plant bombs. This is probably the first of a series of bombs that we're going to be finding on the border. And everything appears to be the more that you allow the terrorists free movement and free activities, so they engage in terrorist activities. It's not necessarily only there for the value of civilian life, and possibly allowing farmers also on the Gazan side to get closer to the border to work their fields. Sadly, we pay the price in terrorism from that every single time.
We sure are, Maurice. I'm sure we'll hear more about it in the coming hours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Turning to judicial reform controversy, where it now appears Prime Minister Netanyahu is pressuring Justice Minister Levin to compromise on his legislation to temper the growing negative consequences. And at the same time, Levin is increasing the pace of Knesset legislation, and another national day of disruption is promised by opponents of the overhaul. ILTV Steve Leibovich reports.
Prime Minister Netanyahu is reportedly pressuring Justice Minister Levin to seek a compromise on his legislation to radically overhaul the Israeli justice system. The two leaders reportedly met 3 times in recent days to discuss the matter, with Netanyahu warning of potential negative consequences on diplomacy, the economy, security, and social cohesion. The meeting came even before Moody's credit agency warned that if the proposed judicial reform are passed, the country's credit rating outlook may be downgraded. Escalating opposition protests will continue tomorrow with a second day of disruption, with demonstrations expected to disrupt the operations at Ben Gurion International Airport and even try to block Netanyahu's planned trip tomorrow to Italy. Levin reportedly expressed openness to changes in the legislation, but would not halt the legislative process or compromise on the core of the bill in his eyes, which is change to the Judicial Selection Committee that would give the coalition majority control of appointments to the High Court. Meanwhile, President Herzog is continuing his efforts to broker a plan that would be acceptable to coalition and opposition. Levin has reportedly been positive about a draft being worked on by former Justice Minister Daniel Friedman, jurist Yuval El-Bashan, protest leader Giora Yaron, and former National Security Advisor Giora Eiland. Netanyahu also reportedly scolded some of his Likud ministers and MKs for disparaging comments they made about protesting IDF reservists. Netanyahu said that refusals are a dangerous development that must be firmly opposed. But it must be done within the limits of civil discourse. He added, "Our goal is to calm tensions and not to inflame them."